Good morning, everybody, and welcome. My name is Jean-Baptiste Minon. I'm the project coordinator of the Assured project. I work at Martella Innovate in Switzerland. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar. It's going to last maximum 2 hours, and our topic today is Assured cybersecurity and insider threats towards practical solutions for efficient and scalable attestation capabilities. We're going to have 4 speakers. Assured is an Horizon 2020 project lasting 3 years, but cybersecurity, we are now in its final year. And on that note, I will soon leave the floor to my colleague Dimitris from UBTech. Just before that, just so you know, the webinar is recorded. And please make use of the chat if you have any questions, comments, and we'll try to address them at the end of each presentation. Dimitris, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jean-Baptiste. Hello, I am Dimitris Kavras from UBTech, and I will start first with a general presentation of the Assured project and the attestation schemes. So, all right.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. So first of all, some general information on the background behind the Assured project. So the motivation, the core motivation behind the Assured project is the provision of certification mechanisms during runtime for cyber-physical systems in order to assure security and privacy guarantees throughout the operational lifecycle of the system. So the core issue is that currently available methods toward validation require exhausting offline testing for every state scenario. And also, as you can see in the bottom right figure, the threat landscape affecting such systems is rapidly evolving. So for example, you can see the report from ENISA, the differences in the key threats affecting such systems, how it has changed between 2017 and 2021, where now the most prominent threats are broken access control, cryptographic failures, in code injection, etc. So in this context, we aim to provide security and privacy guarantees for devices as well as the entire system during runtime, considering this evolving threat landscape. So in this context, we need to provide novel assurance services which ensure the trusted execution of insecure components. We need to safeguard code updates against tampering of these devices. And we need to ensure the compliance of firmware and software to various execution policies. So in this context, we have designed a complete framework that is able to provide operational assurance to such large-scale systems that consist of devices, heterogeneous devices that are characterized by various different security and privacy requirements. Also, we have provided services that establish trusted service graph chains in the next generation systems of systems, which address security, safety, and trustworthiness requirements for mixed criticality services. And we also adopt and implement the zero trust concept, which essentially enables devices to provide evidence on their state, on their configuration or control flow state in a zero trust manner. So essentially considering that no device is considered inherently trusted. So the core technologies that we have explored in the context of Assured in order to construct this, this framework is, first of all, enhanced operational assurance, which aims to increase the trust level in the device, both in regards to its configuration and its execution state by employing real-time tracing capabilities, both software and hardware-based, without impeding the performance of the system. Afterwards, we have risk assessment, which essentially takes into consideration the interdependencies of the devices comprising the service graph chain in order to identify risks and vulnerabilities. Afterwards, we have threat intelligence and information sharing, which essentially entails the sharing of the outcomes of the attestation schemes performed, so they can be provided as threat intelligence to be accessed by various certification and authentication bodies. We use trusted component in order to provide decentralized identity management, so to speak, to provide the devices with the capability to give proof of their identity, so to prove that the device is what it claims to be. Then safety zones detections, which entails the optimal deployment of security and attestation policies through a policy recommendation engine, and vulnerability analysis, which receives the output of various attestation schemes and is able to perform a runtime attack path analysis in order to identify threats and vulnerabilities. So next, we will have a brief overview of the components of the implemented designed assured framework and the core innovations of each component. So we have designed a wide variety of attestation enablers, which will be the focus of today's webinar, which essentially provide lightweight attestation capabilities. We also provide machine learning-based control flow attestation schemes, and the capability to orchestrate different attestation tasks depending on various protection profiles expressed as a form of security policies. So we'll not give many details on the attestation enablers at this point, since they will be analyzed throughout this webinar. Next, we have the runtime tracer, which is responsible for the collection of evidence to use in the context of the aforementioned attestation enablers. And the core innovation of the tracer is that this is non-intrusive to the execution of processes in the attested devices, and also does not affect the performance of the software executing on the device. Next, we have a trusted computing-based SSI wallet, which refers to self-sovereign identities, which essentially provides each device with the capability to give proof on the correctness of its identity, so to guarantee that the device is what it claims to be. Also, it also gives the capability to protect cryptographic keys, such as a DA key, which we will analyze in the following, in a hardware-based manner. And we also enable the merging of SSI and trusted computing benefits in this manner. We have also implemented a variety of blockchain-based services, which enables a decentralized and secure exchange and of information and data sharing. And this provides a wide variety of innovations, such as attribute-based access control. So the ability to access information stored on the blockchain based on the attributes of the party that is attempting to access the information. And also it provides a capability to share and deploy attestation policies in a certifiable and auditable manner. Next, we have the risk assessment module, which is able to identify the risks and vulnerabilities of the system based on the interdependency graph comprising the devices of the service graph chain. And the core innovation is that the risk assessment module can consider both security and privacy related vulnerabilities, and can also perform attack path calculation. Closely connected to this is the policy recommendation engine, which essentially receives the output of the risk assessment engine and performs a constrained problem-solving mechanisms in order to extract the optimal set of security policies. So these security policies will afterwards be deployed to the blockchain infrastructure so that they can afterwards be downloaded by the responsible devices to perform the dictated mitigation measures. Next, we have the security context broker, which essentially acts as the bridge for devices to interact with the blockchain, and is the intermediate party for the deployment of attestation policies through smart contracts. The core innovation of the SCB is the adoption of the gRPC concept for automatic dissemination of these events. So, for example, if an attestation policy is deployed, then through gRPC, all the devices are automatically notified of its deployment, and also access control based on the use of verifiable credentials. And finally, we have the attack validation component, which essentially receives system role traces following an attestation process, and is able to perform device behavioral analysis in order to identify the nature of the attack that has been performed. Okay, so in the context of Assured, we have envisioned 4 use cases upon which the implementation and testing has been performed for the Assured framework. So the first use case is a smart manufacturing use case, which entails the operation of industrial equipment such as robotic arms in tandem with human workers equipped with RFID location sensors. So here we have to ensure that accidents are prevented, so that no accidents are caused to the humans by the robotic arms, for instance. So here it follows that there are very strong data integrity and trustworthiness requirements for the position, for the location data of the worker and the devices. Next, we have the smart cities use case, which involves the use of sensors such as smoke and gas detection sensors and CCTV cameras towards the provision of public safety services. And here it follows that the core focus of this use case is the strong privacy requirements and anonymity requirements for the users operating within such a system, as well as the need for strong authentication and authorization requirements for various stakeholders, so that only only the intended parties can access sensitive information that is stored on the blockchain. Next, we have the smart aerospace use case, where we need to ensure the correct operation of devices, the internal components of an aircraft. And this includes the deployment of software updates from a ground station to the aircraft. So we need to ensure that the device of the aircraft is correct before, during, and after the update. And we need to ensure that this process is protected against security misconfigurations, vulnerabilities of, for example, outdated components, etc. And finally, we have the smart satellites use case, which is essentially entails the execution of safety critical processes by multiple satellites in tandem. So here it follows that we have strong requirements for the integrity of the information exchanged between satellites, as well as the deployment of updates, as in the previous use case, from a ground station to a satellite in a safe and secure manner. So, as it follows from these use cases, there is a wide variety of security and privacy mechanisms of requirements that need to be fulfilled. So we need to provide mechanisms that achieve all these requirements in a wide variety of use cases and application domains. So the method that we use to achieve this, to perform these mitigation measures in Assured, is remote attestation. So the core of the core meaning of attestation is so a verifier. Well, for example, consider a prover device that needs to attest to the correctness of its own configuration state or a software process running on the device. So in this case, a verifier would need to issue an attestation challenge to the prover. Afterwards, the prover would need to measure the state of the software or its configuration using runtime tracing capabilities. It would use this in order to construct an attestation response and sign it using the trusted component of the device. And afterwards, send the authenticated response back to the verifier, who verifies if the response is correct. And if it is correct, the device is considered to be in a trustworthy state. So the attestation mechanisms provided by Assured have the following key features. First of all, the provision of high security, privacy, and trustworthiness guarantees for the device and the system as a whole through trusted computing technologies. We have also designed and implemented local attestation mechanisms for the verification of the correct state of a device locally, which is performed based on the construction of key restriction usage policies as part of the secure enrollment process of a device. Afterwards, we have privacy preserving attestation, which enables the prover to only send, for example, a signature to the verifier to perform attestation without disclosing the state of the prover. Also, Assured is the first project of its kind to provide machine learning-based control flow attestation so that the correctness of a software process can be attested and benign and malicious control flow traces can be classified with machine learning-based techniques. And we also provide certifiable and auditable attestation. So the outcomes of the attestation schemes are stored in the blockchain so that any stakeholders with the appropriate permissions are able to certify the correct execution of these processes, as well as attestation evidence. Okay, so here we provide a high-level overview of the architecture of the Assured framework pertaining to attestation and the action workflow of attestation processes. So, for example, consider a prover device, which first contains a trusted component, which can be, for example, a TPM, a trusted platform module, which provides the basis for the implementation of a TPM-based wallet, which is responsible for storage of the cryptographic keys used in the context of attestation and various cryptographic material. Also, each device has a runtime tracer, which is responsible for the collection of attestation evidence, whether it is a configuration evidence or a control flow evidence. There is also an attestation toolkit, which is responsible for the execution of the remote attestation logic. So, for example, the execution of actions performed in order to construct the response to an attestation challenge. And the attestation agent, which is responsible for the orchestration of an attestation process. So, for example, the verifier can send an attestation challenge to the prover through the attestation agent, and the prover can send attestation evidence back to the verifier through the attestation agent. Also, the verifier is equipped with the same components, and the verifier is also responsible for downloading security policies from the blockchain, which contain the types of attestation actions that need to be performed. It is also possible to have an intermediate worker to which the prover can delegate some attestation actions, which serves two purposes. First, the privacy preserving attestation, so that, for example, the verifier can only receive a signature from the worker that does not need to take the configuration or control flow state of the prover itself. And also it serves the computational purpose. So for example, if the prover is resource constrained, they can offload these computational intensive tasks to the worker. So as we said, there is also the blockchain ledger where the attestation policies are deployed after the policy recommendation engine constructs them and converts them in the form of smart contracts. So there's also the blockchain peer, which acts as the intermediate party between the security context broker and the devices. And the security context broker, which is essentially an intermediate orchestration entity, which is responsible for a wide variety of actions, such as zero-touch configuration of device attestation keys, maintenance and approval of the correct state of device, secure enrollment of devices, storage and retrieval of attestation reports, and secure updates of devices during runtime. So essentially, if we need to summarize the attestation process, after the policy recommendation engine would deploy attestation policies on the blockchain. Afterwards, the blockchain notifies the devices of the deployment of the policies. The verifier downloads the appropriate policy. It issues the attestation challenge to the corresponding prover. the prover calculates traces the required information and constructs the response to the attestation challenge and sends it back to the verifier. And the verifier concludes the process by verifying that the response to the attestation challenge is correct. So, as part of the Assured Attestation Toolkit, we have constructed the following attestation schemes. First, configuration integrity verification, whose purpose is to verify the correctness of the configuration state of a device based on a configuration state that is known to be correct and trustworthy. Next, we have control flow attestation, which is responsible for the verification of the correctness of the execution of a safety critical software process. And this, we have two variants of this. First, we have a zero knowledge scheme to attest the correctness of a control flow process in a zero knowledge manner. And we have a machine learning based technique. So that is, as aforementioned, is able to distinguish benign and malicious traces based on machine learning based techniques. Our colleagues from Darmstadt will speak about that afterwards. We have the direct anonymous attestation scheme, which is able to provide privacy preserving properties to attestation processes. So we have we have swarm attestation, which enables the simultaneous attestation of multiple devices using the three aforementioned attestation schemes. And finally, we have added revocation capabilities, which enable the revocation of a device that has been deemed untrustworthy based on the use of pseudonyms. So this webinar will be focused on the three first schemes, CIV, CFA, and DAA. And finally, we will, Assured has taken major steps forward, both in implementation and in a research standpoint regarding the convergence of security, privacy, and safety in supply chain ecosystems. But of course, there are also challenges to be addressed in the future, such as the establishment of inherently of a federated safety critical systems in a decentralized manner, in a manner that is not owned by a single entity. The provision of the capability of data and system components to make strong statements about their runtime integrity at all times. Next, another consideration is the consideration of strong adversaries that are able to manipulate interactions with secure element, and the design of more generic attestation schemes that can more general purpose attestation schemes, for instance. And finally, the consideration of more complex and interdependent requirements, where in a more multidimensional manner that consider simultaneously security, safety, and privacy. So thank you. That is all from my side. So now I will pass the floor to our colleagues from the Technical University of Darmstadt, Richard and Marco. So unless we have time for a couple of quick questions if there is anything, but we'll also have a more dedicated Q&A session in the end for more, if you would like to ask any questions.
Thank you very much, Dimitris. I think the questions will be dropped in the chat, so we'll review them later on.
Mm-hmm. Okay, then.
Marco, Richard, the floor is yours. Okay, thanks everyone. Then I will start sharing my screen. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Perfect.
We can hear you, we can see you. Go ahead.
Let's start. Okay, hi everyone. I am Marco Chirese from Tech University of Darmstadt, CyberSecurity Lab. Today I'm presenting a graph neural network-based zero-assumption control flow attestation approach developed in the context of Assured. So let's start. So first of all, why attestation? Why is it so relevant? We need to consider that everyone knows that, like, at this point, IoT devices, edge devices are spread around the world, and sometimes this the software is running on them is security relevant, or anyway, we need to be sure that what is running is actually the correct software, the correct firmware. So a way for doing it is collecting the execution, like an execution trace, and using a central trusted unity, which is verifying its execution. So whenever a device is malicious and is not running a software as it was supposed to, we can spot it out and secure all the devices by cutting the connection out, for example, or avoiding this device to influence the others. So moving on, so the motivation then is the current motivation for this work is what is going on in the world, in the wild, in research, is relying on realistic assumptions. Like, for example, having a full control flow graph, which is still an open research problem. It's not so easy to get. Most of the work require memory access, which is, of course, a privacy concern, and others are developing custom hardware for achieving attestation, so which impacts costs heavily, of course. So in real world, we cannot rely on any of these assumptions. So the control flow that we can extract are all incomplete. And from here, we start wondering if machine learning can actually help us. So from this point and this consideration, our research question is raising. So is it possible to utilize machine learning on incomplete control flow graphs for achieving control flow attestation? So now we give a look to related works for understanding what is going on in the wild and what they can do for us. So going very back in the time, so in 1997 was introduced for the first time by Scalable and others, the very first graph neural network work, which was a supervised neural networks for classifying structures, that are basically graphs. And this is a very interesting point for us, since the control flow graph is actually a graph, right? So we need to find a way for classifying them or working with them in an easy way. And maybe the use of graph neural networks is a spontaneous association which can help us. Later on in the time, in 2016, Keith and others introduced the variational graph autoencoders, which are a kind of model relying on graphs, which is working in a supervised way. We will show in details later, which will particularly suit our use case. And we will see how we use them in our context. For what concerns instead attestation and machine learning, these are the main works wrapped here. And as we see, starting from 2019, there are a couple of works from Ma and others, which is achieving attestation on API calls in Android through recurrent models. So they're using sequential kind of data, and they try to achieve attestation of Android software. In the same year, Hu and others is proposing a machine learning supported CFA, which is basically using machine learning for spot out which function will need a fine-grained and classic, let's say, control flow attestation. So just using machine learning as a support. Later on in 2022, we have added a couple of words from Earth and others. For example, the first one is identifying malicious control flow subgraph of malware execution with graph neural networks. In this particular case, there's no detection is happening. They are already working with malwares, and they are trying to spot out which part of a graph is making a malware to be a malware, let's say, in a simple way. The working set from Aman and others is aiming to verify the state of a device by classifying its memory. So basically what he's doing this work is getting the whole memory, dumping it all, converting it to an image, and then using standard classification techniques in machine learning. So let's now give a look to the drawbacks to these works. So starting from the very first works, we have some consideration like limited information for what concern Android. Indeed, we are working on Android APIs, not really on the console flow, which is running in the system. So we are having a partial information from who and that. Instead, for the machine learning assisted attestation, we need to have like a very wide label data set, which is not easy to get. And in the paper, they're using experts for labeling it. And of course, it's creating overhead because they are using machine learning on top of classic techniques. Instead, for Earth and others, they also require that label data set, and they don't do detection. This is the work for a colleague, the work which is doing detection on already malware. So they also require a label data set, which is again not easy to get, and also it's not really performing detection, so it's not spotting out malicious executions. Instead, in the work of Aman and others, it's a privacy nightmare because dumping the whole memory for converting to an image, besides being a lossy conversion, it's of course privacy relevant. So there are some drawbacks here that are not really a good starting point. giving a look at what is not really machine learning at all, like the works from which are using software instrumentation is CFLET from Abera and others, System Security Lab. So my group, there's RECFA in 2021, and with others that are requiring extra hardware like LowFed, again from System Security Group, then Atrium, still from Security System Security Group, and Tiny CFA from De Oliveira Nunes and others in 2021. But in general, all these papers are having the assumption of having a full control flow or creating extra hardware or a heavy instrumentation. So in general, you need anyway a large database of full execution paths or control flow events. So compared to what we are designing, we don't have any full control flow because, of course, it's not easy to get and it's an open source problem. We do not require any memory access. We are not platform specific. Actually, being machine learning can run on any platform which can run this machine learning. Does not require any extra hardware and does not require data labeling as we are running an unsupervised approach. So we want only to consider what is a benign and a legit control flow without assuming to have any knowledge of attacks. We want to be able to generalize on any kind of attacks. So our approach was to be lightweight, only require one benign control flow to run, which to be specific is just one partial execution. So one partial observation of the full control flow graph. So just one execution. It's privacy enhancing since the verify does not need to have any binary. There's no need to expect them. So it's also enhancing privacy for IP protected code. And we can detect ROP attacks and DOP attacks. So that's why the approach is unsupervised learning. What is benign, we can generalize on what is malicious, of course. So ROP attacks and DOP attacks. Of course, we cannot say if an attack is a ROP or DOP, but we can say, okay, this is a malicious behavior, and that's here. It is my my report. So this can happen thanks to unsupervised graph neural networks. So with the approach we are designing using graph neural networks in an unsupervised way, we can achieve all these goals. So now, giving a bit of context of what we are talking about, we want to introduce what we are meaning with control flow graphs and their control flow graph attacks. In this case, here is depicted a control flow graph. In this case, of course, it's assumed to be full just for representation purposes. And in this case, we are seeing two benign execution. One is taking the path from V1, 2, 4, 6, 7, and the other one is taking from V1, 3, 4, 5, and 7. So two paths. Our ROP attacks will design as creating an extra transition. For example, in this case, creating an extra edge in the graph from V6 to V3. So in this case, an execution can be going from V1, 2, 4, 6, 3, and keeping going from 4, 5, and then reaching 7. So of course, the path is partially benign, but there's an extra edge never seen before. What concerns DOP, instead, the story is different because they are the attacks are reusing benign transitions, but they are still altering the control flow. For example, here, keeping in mind these two paths, a possible DOP attacks is simply running from V1, V2, V4, V5, and V7. So the transitions are still benign, but used in a malicious way. So this is what is considered a DOP attacks, a non-control data attack. And going to the background of machine learning instead, this is the model we are using in the project, which is a variational graph of the encoder, as anticipated before. Is a state-of-the-art generative model, which is trained on learning to reconstruct input graphs. So training process here takes a graphing input, in our case, just one, and learns portion by portion to reconstruct it. During this learning process, the model is able to capture the latent features of the graphs, which means being able to capture all the characteristics, the inner characteristics of the graph, so the connectivity, the neighbors, what is like a normal flow in a direct graph. So in this case, the model just takes in input what is called A and X, where A is simply the structure of the graph, so what you can imagine as an adjacency matrix, and X simply the features for each node that we extracted. The feature for each node are again like the number of visits of the node, the connectivity of the node, and any other information which can be extracted by the traces. The traces, again, just for clarifying, are not carrying any other information than the path itself. So all the features are computed from the structure. So during the training process, again, we learn to reconstruct the input graph to the in output. If we are able to do so, the training is considered to be succeeding. During this process, of course, we are able to capture what is the benign patterns in a control flow graph. That's the key part of this project. So now we switch to see the system overview of what we designed. So the very first stage happens through the tracing of the execution. So we're gonna get all the basic block addresses traversed by the program counter in a CPU, and we just report them in a log. From this step happens the pre-processing phase, where this trace is converted to an execution graph, and we extract all the features I just mentioned. The next step is the training. So we create the model, and we start the training with this execution. Afterwards, with another small set of benign traces which we received in input, we calibrate a threshold. The threshold has the purpose of achieving attestation. Basically, we define this threshold, which is saying when a graph will be benign or not. The threshold is calibrated on the distance between the input graph, so the training graph, and the graphing inputs. So we take these graphs, we calibrate the threshold, and the threshold will be ready for attestation later on. So the inference stage of the process instead, we take the encoder we designed, already trained, we get out from the encoder the embeddings or encodings of the graph, which are compared to the training one. We get a distance measure out of it, and we compare it with the threshold. Whether the distance is smaller or equal to the threshold, then the attestation succeeded and the software or the firmware is recognized to be benign. Otherwise, it's failed and the software is classified as malicious. That's why, as mentioned before, the approach is fully unsupervised. We do not need any attack data during training phase. We only need one benign execution that we are able to generalize on. Now, moving on, we see how we implemented the variational graph of the encoder model. In this particular case, the variational graph of the encoder is made of an encoder and a decoder. The encoder, of course, as the word says, to encode the graph down to some Latin representation. So capturing all the hidden features of the graph. The decoder instead takes these hidden features and try to reconstruct the graph from there. In the variational graph encoder, as described from Keith and others, the decoder is simply matrix multiplication. So what is important to design carefully is the encoder. In our particular case, we designed this encoder made of three following graph convolutional layers with other two layers that have the purpose of sampling. I'm mentioning sampling. Why? Because the model is generative and is trained on optimizing the variational lower bound, going a bit more technical, but it's not really relevant for us. So we designed this deep encoder, graph encoder, which is regularized also through the dropout layers and decaying learning rate scheme during the training process. The encoder has the job of the encoder is basically to get the input, expand this dimensionality, getting out the information, and then compressing it down for getting out the embeddings that we mentioned before for the graph. In this particular case, we are mentioning as embeddings the nodes embeddings, not the graph embeddings. So for each node in the graph, we're going to get out one embedding with a specific size, in this case, 24. So we can imagine these embeddings as a fingerprint of the graph, which is capturing all the inner characteristics of the graph that you can use later on for understanding how execution are different to each other. So as said, the model that counts basically only on the encoder part, as the decoder is simply a mathematical step. And the model itself counts only 8,128 parameters. So it's a very compact and lightweight model. Just for reference, for who is not really into machine learning, can imagine that like models are dealing with images, for example, just for mentioning like ResNet 18, they count millions of parameters. So it's very lightweight. And as we will see later, it's a model which can simply fit even in a Raspberry. So how attestation actually happens? Now we're gonna have a look on the process. So first of all, we need to decide, we need to use the distance metrics we defined in the earlier stages for getting the distances between the training execution and the execution we get in input. This distance in particular is called direct outsource distance, which is basically applying a small algorithm to an Euclidean distance. So the pipeline starts when we receive an input a trace, we process it as a graph, and we get out the embeddings of this graph. We compare it to the benign execution, and then we decide if, according to the threshold, if it is benign or not. In this case, we see, for example, the malicious execution. In the case of getting, of course, one benign execution, the distance to the training execution will be like smaller than the threshold, and therefore will be classified as benign. So this makes the system, as said again, to be attack independent and to not rely on any assumption related to the attacks. Not having knowledge of them before, you are able to spot what an attack is by contrast. Now, from this, having described this pipeline, we would like to move to the code to show you a super quick demo to see how this system actually works. So let me switch to the code. Okay, here we are. So as you see here, we simply define the model. In particular, in this portion of code here, we are defining the encoder. As you see before, there are all the layers defined here, and here the function which is defining how data go through the model. Afterwards, we define how the actual model works with the training function, all the functionality that are needed for this kind of purpose. So we define all the steps, we define how the training happens, we try to define how the encoding happens, we define how to encode something which comes from a file, so for example, a trace, so going through the preprocessing, and of course, how to save and restore the model. When we initialize the model, like for example, on CPU, not necessarily on GPU, because not necessarily they are available, we simply initialize the model here. We see the report of it, and we can see how large it is. Again, it's 8,128 parameters, trainable parameters, of course, which translates to basically having around 70 kilobytes in memory. So super compact, lightweight model. In this case here, we want also to load one execution, which for us translates to having a data set for the training. In this case, we are working with a cryptographic software, in this case, AES, from a use case partner. We are loading it. We are preparing it basically for training in this phase. And we can also give a look to the footprint in memory. It's just less than a kilobyte, so very compact. You need to consider that like these traces usually are like around 20, 30, 40 megabyte per trace. So even representing it in a graph way, you are very much compressing down the dimensionality of the files, and so of course the footprint in memory. Then of course we go through the training phase, which setting up most how much we want to train. We use the benign execution for training. We see all the training steps. Here you see it already, the early stopping hitting the process. So saying, okay, the model I just found is good. Let's move on and see if it improves. It does. Till the end, we have like a very generous learning rate of 500 epochs. Just because the training on graphs sometimes can be tricky, so we want to be sure that what we get out the out is really the best. And simply visualize the training process, we see that it's a great improvement. Instead, the purple line you see here is how the learning rate decays for regularizing the training and making it more stable and less oscillating. Then, of course, we can store the model or restore a previous one if you already have a good one. The next step here is then actually achieving attestation. So the first step for us would be simply getting the encodings of the training execution. So those fingerprints that I was mentioning before, because we be like our reference trace during the process. Then as first, just for evaluating the system, we want to test this model against all the other benign executions. For this use case here, we have 260 executions. We test against all of them. We get out the scores, we get out the distances, and then we will observe how the model behaved. We define a threshold here, just with a size of 10 of these traces, on the distance of these 10 traces to the reference one. So the threshold is defined. The system is basically ready for attestation. In this case, we want to evaluate against ROP attacks that we generate in a synthetic way, very generically. So for example, in this case, we are evaluating a ROP attack where we get benign execution that we synthetically added 5 additional edges, 10 additional edges, up to 500. Of course, 500 is heavily modifying a graph. It's basically just for showcase, but already for the very first addition in edges, we will see that the system is able to attest correctly. Okay, so here simply we get the encodings of the malicious execution, we get the distance of them compared to the reference one, and then we simply get the score of it, and we keep going for evaluating the others. For DOP attacks, similarly, we simply get a benign execution, we synthetically generate DOP attacks. For this generation in particular, we design custom algorithms, going down to researching literature, how these attacks should look like. indeed, designing DOP attacks is very complex, as probably most of you know, and we found out that contacting even one of the authors of the original paper of DOP attacks, that they were using on a very small software a chain of 2,000 steps. In our case, we decided to fix these 2,000 steps on our traces that are like, for example, in the case of IS, around several millions of steps. So we keep this number, and we perform DOP attacks, and we evaluate them in the same identical way. As we will see, of course, DOP attacks have much lower scores than ROP attacks because their impact on the graph is smaller, but still, thanks to the feature we extracted previously, we are able to capture them. Of course, as you see here, the orange points are representing the ROP attacks, the green points, the DOP attacks, and as you see, they are much more close to the threshold than to the blue points that are representing the B9s. But still, they are able to be spotted. Afterwards, for completing evaluating the system, we evaluate the metrics for what concern ROP attacks. Okay, here, for example, it's reporting one evaluation, and for what concern DOP attacks. In this particular case, we have a very low false positive rate, which is of 0.38%. So our detection is very accurate. We are able basically to avoid misclassification of B9s executions. So from this point, I would move directly to the full evaluation of the system in the context of assured, and we are back. So this is the evaluation of what concern all the use case partners and plus Bench IoT. And Bench IoT is benchmark suite counting 18 benchmarks of base functionality used in IoT devices. So that's why we wanted to evaluate for having a clear view of how this system is performing in the edge devices or IoT devices. But pushing further, the use case partner having much more complex binaries, starting from Diffie, Hellman, DEST, Ghost, and RS, very complex binaries, which are represented by graphs that are up to 9,000 nodes. These are the evaluation. Basically, for what concern ROP attacks, we have like a very generally 3% of false positive rate, in general, like a very high F1 score, so which translates to a very high precision of detecting attacks. Instead, for DOP attacks, as they are more stealthy, the F1 score is slightly lower, but still quite good considering that we're like working with basically zero assumptions and with super low amounts of data for evaluating the system and, of course, for spotting out these attacks. So now we want to also consider the evaluation of the performance of the system, not only in terms of accuracy in detecting attacks, but also the impact on computational devices, so where they will be run on. And as we can see here, so on the prover side, we need to, the traces for our case, for the use case partners, counting also in Bench IoT, are around 6.5 million steps. That translates to a pre-processing time from 1 to 3 seconds, according to of course, the use case. Some are more complex, some less complex. We are able to pre-process like in linear time. So going through the traces, we are able to get out all the information we need and building the edge list and then the graph. So the processed trace size, as we've seen before, is around 94 kilobyte, 0.94 kilobytes. So even sending it through the network is very lightweight and it does not create much overhead. From the verifier side, instead, the model training time on a Raspberry Pi is around 5 minutes, so super fast and very acceptable in these terms. And the attestation runtime instead is much lower than a second. So from this point of view, we consider our system to be very lightweight and deployable in the context of assured, of course, and IoT and edge devices. So that's it from my side, and thank you all for the attention. If you have any questions, we are here.
Okay, thank you very much, Marco.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So if there are any questions, we have some time now, or we can collect questions in the chat and answer them at the end of the meeting. Okay. Okay, doesn't seem to be any questions, so we can proceed. So, Richard, do you also have a presentation, or?
Oh.
Okay. All right. So this is it from side of Darmstadt. So we moving forward to Alexander Sambanis from Urbitech, who will speak about configuration integrity verification. So Alexander, the floor is yours. Alexander, we can't hear you.
We cannot hear you, Alexander.
Hold on, there seems to be a technical issue. Alex, can you hear me?
I think he dropped out of the call.
Okay.
And he's trying to join again. So, okay, let's try to see if we can fix that.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yes,
we can hear
now
you.
we can. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Sorry for this technical issue. Can you also see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. In my presentation, we will talk a little bit about one of the attestation schemes that we have integrated in the Assured framework, the control integrity verification, or CIV. First of all, just an overview of the architecture of the different Assured components, the blockchain, which basically sends some policies and the attestation tasks to the verifier device, which receives it through the gRPC client, which acts as a proxy, and through the verifier's attestation agents, it forwards the attestation tasks on the device which the verifier wants to attest, in our case, the prover. And there the prover uses the tracer as well as the TPM in order to fetch some traces and create some policies which will bind its keys later on. And then it also forwards this attestation. It creates an attestation report. It forwards it to the verifier, saying if it is in a correct state or not. And this information is pushed back on the blockchain as a smart contract. This is just an overview of the architecture. So the control integrity verification, what it does, it basically enables the enrolled device, such the prover as we saw before, to attest to their correct configuration during runtime when requested through an attestation task through a deployed attestation policy. This protocol is responsible for calculating the configuration of a run binary, which runs inside the prover as a hash digest, so it can be used from the TPM as a key restriction usage policy, and then this policy to be binded to the keys that are created inside. To make sure that every time we fetch it, the hash trace of a binary is compared on the go with the expected one, which we are calling a golden hash, and basically represents the correct state of the device or a binary. We're using a storing facility of the TPM called the PCRs, Platform Configuration Registers. And so we can be able to have direct access to this golden hash and be able to fetch it through various TPM commands and use it for comparison. Basically, it is essential to ensure not only the security of the underlying host and loaded software processes, but also to secure their privacy and confidentiality. Because an attacker should not be able to infer any information on the configuration of any of the binaries loaded in the same node. To this end, a prover needs to be able to attest all of its components through a zero-touch manner, without the need to reveal specific configuration details of its software stack or any other attributes that it may have. So basically, for the Assure project, we have integrated the local attestation by verifying the correct state of a prover device without the verifier, which attests the prover, without the need for the verifier to be able to know anything about the prover. So it has zero knowledge over the prover, some attributes, probably system properties, etc. So in order to achieve this, we have integrated key restriction usage policies and also a tracer, which we will discuss later on. So for the key restriction usage policies, we basically need a third trusted party to construct a policy digest, which will be binded with the attestation key that is created inside the TPM. On the right side, you can also see we have some TPM commands flow just for the overview. We won't get into depth with them. Basically, the prover loads from the PCRs a predefined correct state of the device through a TPM command. It verifies the freshness and the integrity of the output of the tracer, and uses a certificate from a trusted third party called the Security Context Broker to construct the final runtime policy digest and gain access to the attestation key. Yes, through the policy authorize command, which is basically, this command allows us to basically supports in our protocol the updates of binaries through runtime, because we can basically change the authorization when the binary is changed according to the flow of the binary. For a device to enter our network, either this is a prover or a verifier, it first needs to to execute the device registration phase, which first of all, the execution part that is directly connected to the control integrity verification is the extension of the PCRs that happens during this phase with the golden hashes of the binaries that we want to attest, and we know that basically this is the correct state that our binaries need to be. Why do we need the secure onboarding of a device? Basically because we're creating our keys in a trusted manner. We're blocking unauthorized key usage through these key restriction usage policies. And we are also storing the predefined representation of the device state in the DPM's PCRs, as we have already said. And we are able to attest against all allowed software. But a major part of this process is basically establishing a trust between the tracer and the TPM, which we will discuss later, and verifying that the configuration hashes, the ones that we are considering as correct, are coming from a trustworthy source. So, yes, one last thing. When the secure enrollment phase ends, if it is successful, the node is an authenticated and legitimate member of the network and ready to register to any of the provided services, including the blockchain and the attestation policy sharing. So, for the control integrity verification as a protocol, basically this service lets the control integrity verification of the verifier request, basically it lets the verifier request control integrity verification traces, and in turn the prover, after this request, computes the prover through the tracer that runs on it, computes the hashes over all loaded libraries and programs in the edge device. Finally, the tracer signs these generated traces and sends them to the prover's TPM for verification and signing with the produced attestation key before sending it to the verifier. After receiving a trace over a Unix socket, which we have established in our protocol, the verifier first validates the trace's signatures. If this signature verification fails, an error is reported and is detected as an attack. If not, the verifier moves on to verify the traces themselves. And yes, for the control integrity verification, this entails comparing each space hash with the expected valid hash of the corresponding library or program that was scheduled to be deployed in the device. So the attestation key can only sign upon approval from the tracer, as well as holding correct PCR values with the golden hashes. In order to allow this, the tracer must first sign a nonce. This is done by starting a session. It signs the nonce and returns it. The client then executes a policy PCR inside the session to verify that it is in a correct state. After the tracer's public key is loaded into the TPM and policy signed is executed, then we're able to verify the integrity of the tracers. And then continue using the policy or command to be executed and be able to verify that the the binary is in a correct state. So, as we have talked, the tracer is a basic component in our framework, but we need to verify that it is trusted and it is part of our trusted computing base. In order to achieve this, we basically execute a protocol securing the integrity of the reported traces, and this protects our whole framework from replay attacks and impersonation attacks, and ensures the integrity of the traces during the correct protocol execution. So the tracer is responsible for continuously monitoring the processes executed in the device it belongs to, and collects information that is required in the context of our attestation schemes. These informations can include control flow graphs that are then sent to the control flow attestation toolkit that we saw before in the previous presentation. And it can also compute hashes of configuration properties that are used in our scheme, the control integrity verification. The tracer is executed as a user program and needs to be added to our TCB, as we said. And in order to prove the validity of the measurements that the TPM receives from the tracer, we employ a pre-installed key. This key will be used to send the signed trace to the verifier, who is responsible for verifying their integrity. So, yes, the shared key is the attestation key that is created inside the TPM. For every invocation that our agent, our orchestrator, does to the tracer, the TPM creates again a session and shares the session nonce with the TPM. The tracer then calculates an authorization digest, which includes this session nonce, as well as the attestation key name, which is basically the public part of the attestation key hashed. So the tracer has basically calculated an authorization digest. Afterwards, it can sign this authorization digest with a private key, and the TPM will load this tracer's public key and execute the policy sign command with the same session. And this way, if this command has succeeded, yes, the session digest that the TPM has should now match the policy digest of the TPM key. So we are able to use the attestation key inside the TPM to sign data from the tracer, so that we know that the verification, so that we know that the integrity of the TPM, of the tracer, sorry, is correct and not a malware one. So what this offers us, this protocol of securing the integrity of the tracer, is basically that we have some security properties regarding some attacks that are not feasible anymore, such as replay attacks, because a malware user, if it tries to enter our network, every time the policy signed is executed, it requires the session none. So the attempt of a replay attack would be detected when the TPM calculates this reference value through the policy, through the TPM command. Also, we are verifying the tracers, the integrity of the traces. So if the software stack of the prover device changes, the traces values that have been transmitted also change, and this change would be detected during the verification phase, since the signatures would not match the ones from the provided traces. And also, it is not possible. A malware tracer is not able to impersonate a legitimate one, as the adversary cannot access the tracer's private key, and it would be unable to provide a valid signature over the authorization digest. So, last but not least, a little bit about how the tracer, the invocation of the tracer works, and what data sends as a response. Basically, the tracer maps the location of each page loaded in memory for the libraries, reads the contents of those pages, and basically computes a hash based on them using SHA-256 algorithm. So the produced trace contains a set of hashes representing the in-memory configuration of the device. As it is seen on the screen, this is basically a representation of the CIV response, of the tracer response when we were requesting CIV traces. And these values are used for hashing and signing, and basically these are used for the verification purposes that we have mentioned in our presentation. So I think that's all. Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Thank you, Alexandros, for your presentation. So I see we are in a good position with regards to time. So if there are any questions for Alexandros. Okay, so I think we can move to the final presentation of this webinar, which will be done by Stefanos Vasiliadis from Ubitech with regards to direct anonymous attestation and identity management.
Hello, Dimitris. Hello, everyone. Let me share my screen. Alex, you have to disable your share screen before I am able to share mine. Alex?
Hold on, I will put it.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So, as Dimitri said, I'm going to be talking about direct anonymous attestation and identity management. So, what is direct anonymous attestation? Basically, direct anonymous attestation is a special kind of group signatures that uses authorized credentials, which are then blinded to perform anonymous signatures. Based on this protocol, we actually managed to enhance it with revocation capabilities and attribute-based DAA. So what is all the fuss about DAA? So first of all, it offers user and control anonymity, which means that the identity of the user cannot be revealed and multiple signatures cannot be linked to each other. Non-frameability, which means that an adversary should not be able to impersonate honest platforms. And non-forgeability, which means that valid signatures are only producible by honest platforms and that verifiable and linkable when specified only. So for this purpose, we have our trust computing base, which is consisted by the privacy, which is basically usually the TPM vendor or the manufacturer of the platform. The privacy is responsible for issuing the DAA credentials, and we have the secure context broker. The secure context broker is another trust entity that is only responsible for issuing the key restriction usage policies during the secure enrollment, as Alex was describing. On the host, we have the TPM and the tracer, and all together collaborates to create the DA signatures. From an implementation point of view, the privacy and the secure context broker can be the same entity, but right now we have separated them just to showcase the distinct functionalities of each entity. And then we have the verifier that it's agnostically, we don't care who he is, we just send him the signatures to verify their correctness. So the direct anonymous attestation can be broken down in two separate phases. We have the join phase and the sign phase. On the join phase, basically what we do is we make a challenge to the privacy A and we get the DA credentials. And the sign phase, we actually use those DA credentials to prove to the verifier or to the privacy A or whenever we want that, okay, I got my credentials, I'm using my DA key correctly, check it out, and let's continue. So in the join phase, for those who don't know what the TPM is, one of the most important features that it has is that it has a pre-established key, the endorsement key, that is hard-coded inside the TPM, inside of the hardware, can't be accessed by anyone, and it's not known by anyone, even by the TPM manufacturer. So in the diagram, you see the actual implementation, the TPM commands, and with white dots, you can see what happens in the device, and with pink dots, you can see what happens in the privacy. So whenever we want to get our DA credentials, what we do is we ask for the TPM to send to the privacy A the public part of the endorsement key. With this public key, the privacy A creates a fresh challenge and makes the first set of credentials. This is sent back to the device, so the device unwraps the credentials, takes the challenge and sends it back to the privacy A. If the challenge that was originally created by the privacy A and the one that was resent to the privacy A are the same, then the privacy A can continue to create the DA credentials. Why is that? Because that means that the challenge that was originally created and was wrapped into a credential for a specific TPM actually got returned by this TPM. So the privacy A creates the DA credentials, sends them back to the TPM. The TPM decrypts the credentials and saves them for further use. So we move on to the DA sign phase. Now the device uses the DA credentials that got from the join phase and randomize them both in the trusted and the untrusted world. This happens basically because for performance reasons, because the hardware is much slower than the host. So we separate the randomization both to the host and inside the TPM. And then we ask from the TPM to calculate a signature, and all of those values collaborates with each other to create the final DA signature. As you can see here, we have another command called tpm2 hash right here. This is executed basically because the DA key is a restricted key, and we have to have guarantees that everything that's going to be signed or recalculate something inside the TPM, etc., have to be produced by a TPM. So here we have our implementation evaluation. The implementation is done in C. The tests are in a Raspberry Pi 4. So the problem in hardware security in trusted computing is the performance. You gain a lot from a security point of view, but you pay a lot in time. But as you can see here, actually the timings are not really bad. So even in a critical infrastructure, you can employ this strategy to protect your integrity. So let's continue now to the identity management. The TPM-based wallet is our crown jewel of our framework. Here we have the same trusted computing base with the DAA, the typical DAA, but now we have another trusted entity, which is the VC issuer. The VC issuer now is responsible for creating the verifiable credentials. The verifiable credentials are basically a representation of the attributes a holder has. So what do we gain with the TPM wallet? First of all, holder binding, which means that it must be ensured that an issued entity gets the credentials only to the intended holder. Device binding, we use the DA key to bind the verifiable credentials to the specific TPM after the join phase, of course, of direct anonymous attestation. And finally, we have selective disclosure, which basically means that verifiable presentations should be constituted collections of claims that the holder can construct, disclosing only those attributes needed for verification without revealing any other information. Apart from that, we have typical DAA properties, security properties as full anonymity and traceability, and most important, wallet correctness, which basically means that anytime that a verifier wants to attest against the wallet, he can make a challenge, and then the wallet has to produce a representation of its state so that the verifier can know that all the attributes are there, or the verifiable credentials are not tampered or something like that. So here, as I said, we have the join phase. We have now a new phase, which is the get verifiable credentials. And finally, we have create verifiable representations. In the first phase, the join phase, it's exactly the same as the join phase of the typical direct anonymous attestation protocol. And now we have the verifiable credential phase, but there the device sends to the VC issuer the DAA public key along with the DAA signature as a proof that everything was done correctly in the join phase. The VC issuer then generates the relevant attribute keys for the verifiable credentials and includes the DAA public key as an identity attribute. The device then takes the VC, the verifiable credentials, and stores them for further use. And finally, we have create verifiable presentations. So here, the device blinds the verifiable credentials with a random nonce, to ensure unleakability. Again, this happens both in the host and inside of the TPM for performance reasons. And then the holder chooses which attributes he wants to disclose, and all the other remains hidden. The device then asks from the TPM to perform a signature, and all of those values are collaborating with each other to finally create the verifiable representations. The verifiable representations are then usually pushed to the blockchain to be used from ABAC or another tool of our attestation toolset. Here again, we have our evaluation. You can see that the heaviest thing here is basically the wallet correctness, which happens with policy authorized NV. Wallet correctness and basically supports updates in the protocol. But again, the verifier, which is has a great computational power, 1.3 seconds is not that bad for such security properties. So, okay, we've talked about the protocols, but are there any, can we use it in somewhere? So we actually can, and we're working on other projects as well. We can use it in connected cars for transmitting SIGCAM messages. So we can have zero trust to each component. We can use it for smart cities, gaining anonymity and privacy of each user, strong authentication and authorization, decentralized identity management, integration of legacy devices, smart aerospace case, where we move towards to remote maintenance, strong guarantees of secure software updates, and finally, as it is more trending, risk-based architectures, where we formally verify security controls for the hardware and make efficient attestation for only those updates that break the trust model. This is done on not only for the project Assure, but in Connect, Rewire, Door, and other projects. That's it for me. Do you have any questions, or we can proceed to the Q&A session?
Okay. So I don't believe there are any questions. Okay, so this, thank you very much, Stefanos, for your presentation. This concludes our presentation for this webinar. So if Jean-Baptiste, Margota, if you would like to add something.
Yes, thank you very much to all the speakers for this very good webinar. We were almost 50 at some stage. That's very good. The recording will soon be available on the website, on the Assured website. So for anyone who wants to do some follow-up on this, I'm dropping the link in the chat. There you go. And I guess for all those who registered, you will get a follow-up email with more details about this webinar. So thank you very much once again to all the speakers, all the organizations. This was thanks to Margota. And I think wish you all a beautiful day.
Okay, so thank you very much to all the speakers for their very interesting and informative presentations. Thank you very much, Jean-Baptiste and Margota, for the organization of this webinar. And thank you to everyone for attending. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.